Okay, you've done your best, you've driven towards the date, but it's not going to happen. Now what? Well, now it's time for a delay. How do you go about delaying a game? Now, moving a date can actually come with a lot of externalities alongside of it. In Europe, in order to allow pre-orders, you actually have to have an official date. You can't just be out in the future forever. You actually have to have a date set. If you move that date publicly, then you have to effectively refund the pre-orders and then have people pre-order. I think the game platforms and stores have smoothed this out a lot in the last couple of years, but it used to be basically your pre-order numbers went boink, and then you had to recover, and usually you didn't actually recover back up to the original numbers. So it's something to keep in mind. If you're part of a public company, there's going to be a lot of pressure not to cross fiscal boundaries. So most public companies divide their reporting up into quarters, which are 3 months long. Weirdly, for reasons that aren't really worth explaining, their fourth quarter actually ends at the end of March. So you end up with the first quarter at the end of June, the second quarter at the end of September, the third quarter at the end of December, and then the fourth quarter at the end of March. Moving across any of those fiscal boundaries messes up the planning that was being done for the way that they were reporting their earnings to the street. Moving across that last one, that Q4 boundary, moves you into a brand new fiscal year. So you are going to get an immense, often insurmountable amount of pressure not to cross that fiscal boundary. One of the reasons that I actually really like the concept of Q1, i.e. March to June, as a launch window for games is that it gives you a lot more ability to move around if that proves necessary. If you're in a public company, that is. Okay, so you know you need a delay, you know how big it's going to be, but you're part of a big organization. So how do you get them to buy in? Well, if you've got a completely rational organization, maybe just presenting all of the data is enough. But that's not always the case. In fact, it often isn't the case. So what you might need to do is essentially come with a menu of potential benefits from a delay. You can show the game as it will be without a delay, or it might be, and then show several different potential opportunities if you move the date. This is how we moved Dragon Age Inquisition that first year, is by adding playable races and adding mounts and adding more to the game. The original plan was to do all of those things, but the original date just didn't allow them to exist. So they were already kind of planned. They just had been essentially preemptively cut from the initial scope. So by presenting a potential scope increase along with a date move, but you're getting time for both that extra stuff, but also the original stuff, that might be a way to potentially negotiate your way to a bit more time. As long as we're talking about Dragon Age Inquisition, you might be wondering, how in the world did we have to move the date an entire year? Well, the reality is that original date, that 2013 date, was never a publicly communicated date, was a date that was kind of forced upon the team. There was only so much appetite for a project to take longer than a certain length of time at EA in that time period. There was excitement around the new console generation, which was launching in around that time period. So Dragon Age Inquisition was able to kind of sneak in and say, yeah, we'll be a launch title for the Xbox One and the PS4. We didn't really ever believe in that date, but it got the project greenlit. If you think about it, for Dragon Age Inquisition to have come out in 2013 on Frostbite, you have to remember that development on this game was starting in mid to late 2011. So it would have been a 2-year project to turn that around, which for non-RPGs might seem rational, but for Dragon Age Inquisition, on new hardware, new engine. It was never really going to happen. But even still, even in spite of the fact that that date was never really possible or plausible, we still had to come to the table with a list of gives in order to get that date moved. Good news is those are all things we wanted to do anyway, so it all worked out in the end. You've decided you're going to move. You decided that the right thing for the team is to move your date. How do you communicate this? So this can actually be a really dangerous moment in your production, because you move the date, and what you often find is that suddenly all those features that you had cut or suppressed or pushed into DLC come back rise out of the swamp and come clawing at you, and suddenly you've eaten up all that time and you've accomplished nothing. So what you need to do when you move the date is to keep the constraints in place as much as possible. It's going to be impossible in most cases to keep them completely there, but as much as you can, keep the team focused on actually shipping, because presumably you're not slipping your date, you're not delaying early in vision, you're doing it in most cases late in production or into the alpha phase. Opening up a bunch of doors in those phases is going to consume all of that extra time you just got and not accomplish very much at all. So you need to keep the team focused on completion as much as possible. In certain targeted cases, you might be able to add a few extra features in. Maybe the reason you're delaying isn't because you weren't going to get done on time. Maybe it's because you realized that the game wasn't good enough, in which case you have no choice. You've got to pull a few things from the backlog into reality in order to improve your quality, but you got to be really careful. A great example where this was done very well was on Dragon Age Origins. Dragon Age Origins originally was going to be PC only, and it was done in early 2009, and then the game was being ported onto the consoles, partially by an external team, but partially by internal teams. During that time, we were very disciplined about not reopening the PC version of the game to allow a whole bunch of things to change. And certainly there were things that lots of team members wanted to do to that game in those months, but we were very tight. We did do a couple of things. We changed people's underwear because it was even worse than what's in there now, if you can believe it. But there wasn't very much done. The first instinct you might have, especially if you've been trying to drive a lot of completion urgency, which we've talked about before, might be to not actually tell the team at all, to just know you're going to miss your date, but just keep pushing towards that original date as hard as you can in order to keep that completion urgency high. This is a really dangerous thing to do. Your team isn't stupid, and if you do that for too long, one of two things is going to happen. Either the team is going to think that you are an idiot and lose confidence in you, which is a very dangerous situation to be in, because they know that their stuff isn't getting done, so how in the world can we keep pushing towards this date? Which means the completion urgency is going to go away, or they are just going to give up and think that it's impossible and they're never going to make it, so why even try? So again, the completion urgency is going to go away. And then when you realize that's happening and you try to recover by actually moving the date, then you've already damaged that relationship with the team. It's really hard to rebuild that. When it becomes obvious that it's not going to happen, then what you need to do is you need to delay. And you have to tell your team. So when you're delaying, there can be a temptation to move it as little as you can get away with. And you sometimes see this done. Mass 1 actually got delayed a whole bunch of times, but only very small amounts. And it then built up into this actually relatively large delay. I don't really like that because, like not delaying at all, the team isn't really buying into it. What you're trying to do is you're trying to keep that completion urgency high, because you're saying, keep running, the finish line is only another 100 yards, another 100 yards, another 100 yards, another 100 yards. But of course, the second time you do that, the team is going to realize that, wait a minute, it's not 100 yards, it's way farther than that. And it can actually really blow up in your face if the team decides that you're just stringing them along, moving the goalpost little by little to keep them sprinting as long as they can. If you're going to move the date, try to only move it one time. Try to move it to something that is believable, that you can get behind, that you can push towards. Now, you might be off by a little bit. Dragon Age Inquisition moved a year and then moved an additional 6 weeks late in its development. I would argue basically just about accuracy of prediction. The precision of your predictions isn't really 6 weeks is well within the error bars when you are 3 years out. But do your best. Try not to move twice. Certainly don't move 5 or 6 times. It's just not good for the team. And again, you're going to undermine their confidence in you. One thing that you might be thinking of is maybe you'd be better off without a date at all. And honestly, I've kind of come to agree with that sentiment to a certain degree. Until you are at alpha, I think the predictability of your date within most genres within video games is pretty questionable. The reason for that is a lot of the work that you are doing is creative work, and it's pretty hard to predict how long Make It Fun is going to take in a lot of cases. So putting a date down on a piece of paper before you've gotten to alpha is often kind of arbitrary. That being said, I do think that a date does provide completion urgency, and we keep coming back to that as being something that you need on your project. Without the need to put your pencils down and be done with something because a date is approaching, some people on your team will never be done with something. They will keep iterating forever because almost all features could be slightly better or at least slightly different, and you may churn for all time. If you want to go the Blizzard route and basically make it done when it's done, be aware that often that's going to come at the consequence of essentially having a lot of difficulty completing anything. Now, maybe there's a way where you can have an internal date for alpha, which you're striving towards, and then you can delay and move that around as necessary. You could put the pressure on that alpha date. It means that you don't have the externalities of potentially refunding pre-orders or moving across fiscal boundaries because you're not in the fiscal plan yet. And then once you hit alpha, you can relatively accurately predict the game is now going to ship this much in the future, because you can figure out how quickly you can burn down bug curves, how quickly you're getting through triage. It becomes a lot easier to predict when your date is going to actually be. But as we talked about in the crunch video, getting completion urgency from artificial places like an alpha date can be hard, because the team begins to detect the fact that they are kind of arbitrary, that there is a lot more flexibility there, and that can cause the completion urgency to bleed away. So maybe I do think that having a ship date for your game set on the first day of discussion on that project is super stupid, especially in spaces that require innovation and experimentation. But it's what's done right now in most publishers, so it's what we have to live with. Hopefully you're amazing at predicting your date and you never have to delay, but if you do have to delay, don't wait too long. Your team will start to lose trust in you. Be aware that there are externalities around pre-orders and around fiscal boundaries. Move it once. You don't get to move it over and over again. And then keep a good control of the features as you go forward, because there's always a risk of bloating up your scope as soon as you move your date. So we've got merch. This is high tea on the high seas. There's a lot of other things. You can see the shelf below this video. If you found this video interesting, give it a thumbs up because that will help YouTube know that it should share it with other people. Special thanks to my members. They provide the resources that this channel needs to keep running. If you're interested in becoming a member, there's a link to that down below as well. It does help the channel out quite a bit. What's a game coming up soon that you're really excited about? How do you react personally to delays? For me, knowing games from the inside, usually it's actually fairly obvious why this happened. How do you react to a delay for a game that you've been excited to get your hands on? Let me know that down in the comments. I will see you again soon. Thank you.